have been raised in regards to how Canada's immigration programs, such as the temporary visa programs, can be exploited by human traffickers, and people in these programs can be vulnerable to exploitation. Have these vulnerabilities increased due to COVID-19, and do you have specific suggestions we could recommend to the government to better protect women and other workers?
Thank you very much for this question. I think that labor trafficking is an incredibly important issue in Canada and really deserves more attention. When COVID first began, we saw that there was a real trend in terms of transmission in our agricultural sector, specifically among temporary foreign workers. This, for very good reason, rang a bunch of alarm bells and brought attention to the issue, but I have to say it's incredibly long-standing. Prevalence of labor exploitation along the continuum and insofar as human trafficking is, quite rampant across our agricultural sectors. And in terms of responding to that, I actually think labor trafficking is a little bit more straightforward in that we actually have labor laws and rules that have been established to protect the rights of these workers. They're just not being implemented properly, and it's not being regulated by the appropriate level. So I do believe that this is done through the provincial governments, but I think actually enforcing the laws that we have would go a really long way in addressing this. Labor traffickers are clearly breaking the law, and it's much more black and white to be able to determine where a crime of trafficking is actually taking place.
Thank you. I will share my time with Ms. Hutchings.
You're on mute, Ms. Hutchings.
That always helps. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. This topic is certainly important to all of us, and hearing your testimony really makes us work even harder. But I also want to thank you for your advocacy. Your advocacy has truly made a difference, because year over year we have increased our investments, and we've provided stable long-term funding for organizations such as yours to empower women and create change across communities. Between 2015 and 2019, our government's increased the funding to women's and gender-seeking organizations from under $20 million a year to over $65 million per year. That's giving long-term funding to over 500 organizations. And this year, we're going to approve funding of $110 million, and that is in addition to the $90 million given by Wage to help organizations due to COVID-19, and another $10 million from Indigenous Services Canada. That's helping 1,000 organizations. So it's your advocacy that is truly making a difference for this. My question for today is for Ms. Duffy. Based on your experience, do you find that the LGBTQ community has faced additional risks and barriers in sex work, especially during COVID-19? And how can we all work hard to address that, if so? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. So I will first say that the discrimination that the LGBTQ community faces in accessing what we would call mainstream non-criminalized work often makes sex work the best option. It's a low barrier entry, and we have a lot of anecdotal reports from workers saying that they experience a sense of community through doing sex work that they don't experience doing mainstream work. However, there are ways that this community is targeted and continues to be over surveillanced by the police force. And so for this reason, they are at risk for being sex workers, and at risk, especially if a person is transgender. They are targeted over police. They are subject to violence. And there's a really interesting report, maybe we can send the committee, about the violence that the police commits to sex workers. Yeah, I think that's all for now.
Okay, thank
Very
you.
good. That's your time. Sorry, Birdie.
Sorry.
I'm going to go to Ms. Matheson now, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I wanted to get quickly back to one of the calls that I know that there's a larger network across Canada for sex workers, advocacy for that. And out of SWAP Hamilton, I received a letter. They were urgently asking the government to allocate funds to organizations working directly with sex workers, but to have far more flexible funding and granting mechanisms to allow for that, considering we don't yet have that decriminalization part. So I wanted to ask a bit about that. What though, and if that actually if you've received that from the government, those low barrier mechanisms that you were talking about before.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I'm completely clear about the question.
So one of the asks was from the federal government to have more of those flexible funding, granting type mechanisms, right? To ensure that funding for organizations that provide support to sex workers, because they're so often left out of any sort of traditional idea of grants or funding, that there be a consideration of that, especially during COVID, but that they were talking about providing even things like prepaid debit cards and those low barrier funding models. So I was wondering if you had actually received any support from the federal government for that after your ask, and I think that was, months ago. So if you received any word on that.
So no, we have not received any funding from the federal government at all. The majority of our funding, especially for all of our operational expenses, even some of our staff who have very limited hours that we were able to secure, has come from community donations, very small fundraisers, people who send $5 from an e-transfer to a PayPal to drop something off. All of our donations, literally 95% of our funding comes from community donors. The biggest grant we've gotten is from a global organization called the Red Umbrella Fund, which is a low barrier grant for sex worker organizations. And then we have received some small other grants from Red Cross and so on that were very high barrier that we spent a lot of time to apply for. And it is a